Chair Anderson and members of the council, I'm Ryan Howell, Fisheries Lieutenant of the Oregon State Police. I'm here on the patrol vessel Guardian and want to thank you for setting time aside from your busy schedules to listen to the Tri-State Enforcement Report, a report which highlights the enforcement work conducted by the states of California, Washington, and Oregon. But first, I'd like to introduce you to Casey Thomas, who recently took the place of Jeff Samuels as captain of the Fish and Wildlife Division of the Oregon State Police.
Thanks, Lieutenant Howell. Mr. Chairman, members of the council, it's not easy to fill the boots left behind by Captain Jeff Samuels, who had such a long history of working with PFMC. I truly appreciate the relationship between PFMC and the state's Fish and Wildlife enforcement officers. It's relationships like these that bring together a good balance between enforcement and regulation compliance. As you'll see in some of the following stories, no matter what the rules are, sometimes people have a hard time following them.
Fish and wildlife officers from Oregon and Washington spend many hours patrolling the commercial and recreational halibut fisheries offshore each year. The following highlights some of the cases encountered during the last 2 years. The first being a conclusion to the previously mentioned Pacific Salmon Charters halibut case. As some of you will remember, in our 2017 Tri-State report, WDFW was investigating a halibut case involving Pacific Salmon Charters out of Ilwaco, Washington. Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife Officer Todd Diehlman led the investigation that lasted over a year and a half. It finally came to an end for 2 of the charter boat captains in February this year when they were convicted after an 8-day jury trial in a Pacific County courtroom. Robert Gudgel of Longview was convicted of 8 counts of unlawful recreational fishing in the second degree, which are misdemeanor crimes. His brother, David Gudgel of Seaview, was convicted of 10 counts of unlawful recreational fishing in the second degree, and 1 count of waste of wildlife, which is a gross misdemeanor crime. WDFW Police began its investigation in June 2017 after a client and 2 of his relatives went fishing on the charter boat Westwind. They told officers that during the trip, some of the smaller halibut they caught were placed in a fish box filled with water that was called a live box. Larger halibut were retained during the trip and put in a fish box without water, known as the kill box. At the end of the day, the boat was over the legal limit of fish for everyone on board. The witnesses testified that David Gudgel and his deckhand went through all of the halibut on board and threw 3 obviously dead halibut, they had had their gills cut, overboard in exchange for bigger halibut. They also testified that 4 additional halibut were thrown back at the end of the trip that they believed were also dead to ensure that the boat returned to port with only their legal limit. As a result of that information, WDFW officers conducted a subsequent undercover fishing trip on a different vessel, working out of the Pacific Salmon Charters office. Similar violations were observed during that trip by the undercover officer. At the conclusion of the undercover fishing trip, officers obtained a search warrant for Pacific Salmon Charters to search for records related to prior halibut fishing trips. WDFW Police and NOAA Office of Law Enforcement executed the warrant, seizing passenger manifests and vessel logs. Many written statements were obtained by Officer Diehlman, who contacted more than 100 passengers. Through those verbal and written statements, many passengers described the same events as the original witnesses. Passengers said that some of the halibut discarded for larger fish were observed swimming off, while others were described as slowly sinking, similar to a leaf that was falling from the sky, indicating that the halibut were in fact dead. In March, after 8 long days of trial and a guilty verdict by 6 jurors, the Pacific County South District Court judge sent a clear message that abuse of natural resources will not be tolerated, as she handed down stiff sentences to both men. Robert Gudgel received 40 days in jail, $8,000 in fines, and a year suspension from fishing or even setting foot on a boat. David Gudgel received 55 days in jail, $15,000 in fines, and a year suspension from fishing or being on a boat. The prosecution of the case would not have been possible without the Herculean efforts put forth by the 2 Pacific County deputy prosecutors, Joe Farholt and Ben Haslam, who worked tirelessly on this case. They spent long nights and many early mornings to ensure this case had a successful outcome. The case also would not have been possible without the 19 witnesses who provided first-hand accounts of the laws being violated by the Gudgels. They were the eyes and the ears on this case, and we thank them. On the south coast of Washington, Officer Todd Dealman, along with Oregon State Fish and Wildlife Trooper Dave Herman, conducted joint state offshore recreational halibut patrols. Numerous fishers were found failing to record their halibut. One vessel contacted was occupied by 6 anglers and was found to be in possession of 9 halibut. The owner of the boat was cited for the over-limit violation, and the illegal halibut were seized and donated.
California wildlife officers have been working an ongoing case related to several trawl vessels who have been fishing in the Rockfish Conservation Area, some of which had disabled their required vessel monitoring system during these incursions. The investigation revealed that the vessels and first receivers had been under-reporting their catch on the associated landing receipts. Furthermore, undercover officers had observed the vessel crews unlawfully offloading hundreds of pounds of non-landed catch, which was sold to restaurants and other establishments. Several citations have been issued for these violations, which resulted in fines and jail time. The following highlighted cases are ongoing. California Wildlife Officer Kraus was monitoring VMS when he noticed that one of the trawl vessel's VMS systems was no longer transmitting. However, the officer knew that the vessel had been actively fishing. The next time the vessel in question left port, Officer Kraus confirmed the VMS was still not transmitting and then positioned himself and several other officers in the harbor later that evening. The vessel returned to the harbor around midnight and began to offload to the first receiver, who arrived in a large van. During the offload, a RAV4 showed up, drove alongside the first receiver's van, and removed several ice chests. The officers observed fish and prawns offloaded from the vessel by the first receiver, which was placed into the ice chests associated with the RAV4. This fish was not weighed or documented on a landing receipt. The ice chests were placed back in the RAV4 and the vehicle drove away. The officers performed a vehicle stop on the RAV4 once it was out of sight and the occupants were detained. The first receiver was stopped by the officers once the offload was complete and the van was driving away. When asked, the first receiver said all the fish, including the fish placed into the RAV4, had been weighed and documented on the associated landing receipt. The officer performed a weigh-back where they re-weighed all the fish that were placed into the RAV4 and into the first receiver's van. The weigh-back revealed that there was 537.2 pounds of fish that had not been documented on the landing receipt, including the 328.1 pounds of fish found in the RAV4. When asked about the VMS, the skipper claimed that it was on. The officer inspected the unit and found the cable that powers the VMS had been disconnected. This was the 5th fishing trip the vessel had made without VMS in a 1-month time period. The entire load, 1,896.5 pounds of assorted fish, including groundfish, was seized by the officers, and a check for $3,868.77 was made out to the Fish and Game Preservation Fund. Wildlife officers were monitoring one of the trawl vessel's live VMS tracks and noticed that the vessel appeared to be trawling within the Rockfish Conservation Area again. Wildlife officers utilized the patrol boat Swordfish and motored out to the general location of the potential violation. Using high-powered radar and optics, the officers were able to track the trawler and observe the vessel as it lowered the trawl net into the water and began another trawl set within the RCA. The officers launched the patrol skiff and contacted the trawler while the trawl gear was actively fishing within the Rockfish Conservation Area. The officer instructed the vessel operator to pull the net. The net was raised and the contents of the net were dumped onto the vessel's deck. The net contained several rocks, sea urchins, and juvenile rockfish, including cowcod. The vessel's trip was terminated, and the patrol boat Swordfish escorted the vessel back to the harbor. A portion of the vessel's load was seized and sold to the Fish and Game Preservation Fund.
During halibut and bottomfish patrols, officers have been increasing enforcement efforts related to descending devices. Compliance is getting better, but officers are still finding fishers who scramble to try and rig one up to be in compliance. Officers have been handing out free descenders to just about anyone who will take one, and this is likely the cutest fisher who has accepted one.
In April of 2018, a trooper contacted a boat in the evening as it returned to the Hammond Marina from fishing for bottom fish along the south jetty of the Columbia River. There were 4 people on board, and after counting the fish that were presented to the trooper in the cooler, the trooper found the fishermen were 1 black rockfish over their limit. The trooper requested a consent search of the boat and found 53 additional fish hidden in a tote, which included 1 undersized lingcod and 1 cabezon. One of the subjects was cited and released criminally for exceeding the daily limit of black rockfish, exceeding the daily limit of lingcod, unlawful taking undersized lingcod, and unlawful taking cabezon closed season. The other 3 subjects were all cited and released criminally for exceeding the daily limit of black rockfish. In total, 54 fish were seized and donated to the food bank. Troopers from OSP, along with 2 officers from WDFW, conducted an ocean patrol from the Columbia River to Cannon Beach. Near Cannon Beach, the officers contacted a boat with 5 people on board, angling for bottom fish. When the officers contacted the boat, they could see multiple undersized lingcod on the deck of the boat, and one of the subjects threw 2 of the lingcod overboard as the officers approached. The anglers told the officers that the fish on the deck and in a cooler were the only fish they had caught that day. However, a consent search of the boat's holds found 37 additional lingcod, 16 of which were undersized, and 22 additional rockfish. The anglers were found to be 27 lingcod and 6 rockfish over their daily limit. The boat owner told the officers they had done this before, and if he had seen the officers coming from further away, he would have dumped all of the extra fish overboard. All 5 subjects were criminally cited for exceeding the daily limit of marine fish, taking undersized lingcod, and exceeding the daily limit of lingcod. The lingcod and rockfish were seized.
Commercial passenger fishing vessels, also referred to as CPFVs, are vessels for hire that take passengers sport fishing for a fee. CPFVs are required to be licensed by the California Department of Fish and Wildlife in order to conduct these activities. Additionally, CPFVs are required to complete and submit a daily fishing log and adhere to all the sport fishing regulations. At times, the operators of these CPFVs decide to fish in protected areas, such as the Rockfish Conservation Area or marine protected areas, with the goal of catching larger fish and more fish in order to get an edge over their competitors and potentially secure repeat paying customers. California Fish and Wildlife officers are aware of this activity and have implemented several strategies in order to combat this unlawful behavior with the goal of safeguarding the valuable fish stock which use these protected areas to thrive. Over the last 3 years, California wildlife officers have had numerous contacts with a young man who fishes from his 23-foot striper. Many of the contacts have resulted in citations and successful prosecution related to federal groundfish and the sale of sport-caught fish. Most recently, officers discovered through social media that he was soliciting to take people out fishing for money, even though he did not have a commercial passenger fishing vessel license. Due to his extensive criminal history related to environmental regulations, officers set up an undercover detail on board his vessel. In March of 2019, 3 UC officers boarded the vessel for a day of fishing with the subject. During that time, the subject violated multiple fish and wildlife regulations, including the illegal take in a marine protected area and failing to procure a CPFV license or commercial vessel registration, among others. When the vessel returned to the dock, uniformed officers were waiting to interview the subject. At the conclusion of the interview, the subject was physically arrested, his vessel and fishing gear were seized, and he was transported to Santa Barbara County Jail. In September of 2019, officers were successful in working with the district attorney's office to arrange a successful plea agreement, in which the subject would plead to all 6 counts, forfeit his vessel to the state, be placed on 3 years supervised probation, serve 25 hours of environmental education outreach, and pay a fine. It should be noted that this subject was already on probation out of another county for the illegal sale of recreationally caught federal groundfish. As a result of his new charges, he was also found to be in violation of that probation.
In March 2019, the directed take of Pacific sardine was closed, and federal regulations only allowed loads of 40% or less of Pacific sardine to be landed incidental to a different target species, such as Pacific mackerel. During this time period, wildlife officers received a tip that a commercial seine vessel had just landed a pure load a Pacific sardine in violation of federal regulations, and the Pacific sardine were most likely still at the processor's plant. Wildlife officers immediately made their way to the processor's plant to inspect the catch. During the inspection, wildlife officers were presented with a landing receipt related to the Pacific sardine. The landing receipt documented the landing of 104,065 pounds of Pacific mackerel and 39,036 pounds of Pacific sardine. 39,036 pounds of Pacific sardine was less than the vessel's 40% allowance, and per the landing receipt, the take of the Pacific sardine would have been lawful. Upon inspection of the packing plant, wildlife officers found plant personnel processing and packing thousands of pounds of fresh, unfrozen Pacific sardine, but no fresh Pacific mackerel could be found. When asked about the Pacific mackerel, the packing manager claimed that they had already been sorted, boxed, frozen, and stored. The packing plant manager presented wildlife officers with 64,829 pounds of old, freezer-burned Pacific mackerel, claiming they were the fresh Pacific mackerel associated with the landing receipt. Even if this was the Pacific mackerel, there were still over 39,000 pounds that were missing. The investigation revealed that the frozen Pacific mackerel were not part of the landing in question and were presented to wildlife officers in an attempt to impede the investigation. The landing receipt documented that 39,063 pounds of Pacific sardine had been landed. However, 102,120 pounds of fresh Pacific sardine were found, which was an additional 63,084 pounds that had not been accounted for on the landing receipt. The ex-vessel value of the 102,120 pounds of Pacific sardine landed out of season was $15,318. This case has been presented to the district attorney and is still in the court process.
The 2017 Tri-State Report highlighted an Oregon tuna case in which an angler was contacted by a patrol trooper shortly after making a sale of tuna to a licensed commercial fisherman and dealer, who also happened to own a restaurant. The only problem was the fisherman was not licensed commercially and had caught the tuna on his recreational license. As an update to the case, the restaurant owner was found guilty of purchasing and selling sport-caught tuna and was fined a total of $2,200. The recreational fisherman also pled guilty to the unlawful sale and had his angling privileges suspended for 18 months and was fined $1,300, with $800 of that going to ODFW for restitution.
California wildlife officers received a tip that a commercial seine vessel had taken more than 1 metric ton of Pacific bluefin tuna, which was the federal quota at the time. Wildlife officers staged in Fish Harbor and boarded the vessel when she returned to port later that evening. Upon inspection of the catch, the officers observed numerous Pacific bluefin tuna in the vessel's hold. When asked about the tuna, the captain and first mate claimed they had retained approximately 30 tons of tuna, which was mostly yellowfin tuna, with only a few Pacific bluefin tuna mixed in. When asked if they knew the catch limit of Pacific bluefin tuna, the crew said they knew they could catch up to 1 ton and assured the officer they had not come close to catching that many on this trip. The officers monitored the tuna as they were being offloaded by the first receiver. The officers worked with the first receiver to ensure the bluefin tuna were weighed separately from the yellowfin tuna, since the first receiver originally had no system in place to do so. The total weight for the Pacific bluefin tuna was 7,736 pounds. The trip limit for Pacific bluefin tuna was 2,204 pounds, 1 metric ton. Therefore, the vessel had exceeded their catch allowance by 5,532 pounds. The fish were recorded on a landing receipt, and the vessel was allowed to keep or sell 1 metric ton of the bluefin tuna and the entire load of yellowfin tuna. The department seized and sold the over limit of Pacific bluefin tuna. The price per pound for bluefin tuna was 40 cents a pound. Neptune Seafoods wrote a check for $2,212.80 to the Fish and Game Preservation Fund for the 5,532 pounds of over limit of Pacific bluefin tuna. The case was then referred to NOAA or NIMS for resolution.
Troopers from the Oregon State Police Coos Bay office were advised of several reports regarding wild coho being retained on the Coquille River, where the fish were staging while they awaited the fall rains. One of the boats the troopers contacted was a guide boat who was on a fishing trip with his friend and family member. The guide initially told the troopers they hadn't kept any fish. One of the troopers, however, saw some blood below the fish box and what appeared to be a portion of a salmon in the fish box. The guide then admitted to having 5 wild coho that he knew were unlawful. The 5 wild coho were seized. The guide was cited for unlawful possession of wild coho salmon and aiding in a wildlife offense. The other 2 subjects were each cited for taking wild coho closed season.
Fish and Wildlife Officer Todd Dielman and Officer Thomas Bolt contacted a vessel returning from salmon fishing in the ocean. It was early in the day, and the boat was occupied by only one fisherman, who claimed to have caught his limit. The fisher did admit that he had not recorded his salmon, and the officers felt that he might have planned on making multiple trips. The officers asked him if he had any other fish on board. He stated he did not. Officer Dielman could see a compartment in the floor of the boat towards the bow, and asked if he could look in it. The fisherman reluctantly opened the compartment, revealing a bag containing 2 wild coho salmon. After briefly attempting to convince the officers that they were from the day before, the fisherman admitted guilt. At the arraignment, the suspect initially pled guilty to the charges, but when he heard the potential penalties for the 3 gross misdemeanors he had been charged with, he decided he wanted to speak to an attorney. The case is pending.
In 2017, Northside Rock Products was operating an open-pit quarry and was found to have discharged unpermitted stormwater into the East Fork McKay Creek, an essential indigenous anadromous salmonid habitat stream, without the required permit and above legally allowable limits. In July 2017, the company was issued a civil penalty for the discharge of more than $55,000 by the Oregon DEQ. Letters and documentation show the owner of the company was ordered to immediately discontinue discharge and apply for a stormwater discharge permit. Towards the end of 2017, the Oregon State Police responded to a complaint of the same company continuing to discharge stormwater without an approved permit into the salmon-bearing stream. Sampling showed that the discharge increased the background turbidity of the stream between approximately 200% and 1100%. Evidence obtained and interviews conducted show the owner of the company was deceptive with investigators and chose not to take recommended preventative measures to discontinue his illegal activity. The quarry operator was cited criminally for 2 counts of water pollution in the 2nd degree. In December 2017, the quarry obtained the required National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System, or NPDES permit, and got approval for a stormwater pollution control plan. In early 2018, it was found the quarry was continuing to discharge to the East Fork McKay Creek, and in February 2018, Northside Rock Products was issued an additional civil penalty by Oregon DEQ of over $117,000. On May 3, 2018, the quarry operator pled guilty to 1 count of water pollution in the 2nd degree, was fined approximately $2,000 as part of the criminal investigation, and was placed on probation for a year with the requirement to maintain and comply with the NPDES permit as well as the DEQ final orders from the civil case. On April 4, 2019, members of the Oregon State Police, DEQ, and EPA conducted a search warrant at the quarry and documented several additional violations. On the same date, Oregon Department of Geology and Mineral Industries issued a suspension order of Northside Rock Products, effectively ceasing their operation. In August 2019, DEQ issued an additional civil penalty of more than $127,000 for the repeated violations. The criminal investigation is still ongoing.
I'm on vacation every single day 'cause I love my occupation. I'm on vacation. If you don't like your life, then you should go and change it. I'm on vacation every single day 'cause I love my occupation. I'm on vacation every single day, every single day.